So, I'm here in Prague with my good friend Jackcharles, who's a neuropharmacologist researcher at Melbourne University. You're currently creating a technology that harnesses the dream state. Can you elaborate on that?
It doesn't necessarily harness the dream state. It's an analytical tool that reads brain activity to deploy artificial intelligence, machine learning, to categorize different states of consciousness. Basically an algorithm that can work out any given time if a subject or an animal is awake, what type of wake, if it's asleep, what stage of sleep, if it's in REM sleep or not, all automatically, instead of going through a pretty outdated procedure that has nonetheless remained resilient for decades, which is that of manual scoring, meaning the scientists today fucked it completely.
Scientists today?
With no shame. So the scientists today need otherwise to survey visually brain activity on screens, literally lines going up and down, and then with their knowledge classify and label chunks of data, usually in the 4 to 30 seconds length, for different states, wake, sleep, or deep sleep. It literally went berserk. I think he made a statement.
Deep sleep?
Deep sleep, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you're pretty much automating what currently has been intensive, manual,
laborious, stressful, boring procedure. Okay. Yes, and inaccurate because people get tired and they don't want to do it. And there's personal bias, of course, as well.
Okay. So what other benefits do you think could build on top of your technology?
Well, considering that this widens a major bottleneck in data analysis, which takes a lot of time and a lot of human resources, this opens up all the possibilities that come after this step. So you can data mine the output, you can find out things that otherwise would be very hard to access because the analytical process takes so long and people eventually move on or run out of resources or don't have enough staff to do this. So you can work out insights about different states of consciousness, different states of health, mental health or physical health, and also survey altered states, so that it would be possible to categorize in the same way we differentiate between vigilance states, wake and sleep. We can now categorize different states of wake. So the normal status quo of consciousness, or that could be achieved through breath work or through the use of different psychedelic substances or meditation practice.
Now, you're quite an experienced practitioner of going into realms of altered states. You recently went to Mexico and sampled venom from the Bufalvarus toad, yes, which produces a complex venom that contains the most potent ingredient, perhaps, is 5-MeO-DMT amongst 19 or so other alkaloids, psychoactive alkaloids. Can you comment on the experience?
Well, the experience is one of the most intense that can be achieved with psychedelic substances. It is very sudden because the venom has to be smoked, has to be vaporized. So this basically is a very sudden onset and basically brings the subject and brought me to an altered state very quickly, and it disintegrates your cognitive landscape in a way that I would basically describe as a very, very powerful vacuum that just sucks out all your sensations, all your ideas, and And all you're left with, this is ridiculous.
Excuse me, sirs, but I need to get together.
Will you be able to edit it?
Yeah.
We won't be like staggered and all that.
No. So it sucks out all your ideas and...
Yes, and all you're left with is basically what it's been described as like the big white. Like all the colors disappear as well, and you're just left with this white, pure noise, which is the noise of your internal neural substrate. And this is almost impossible to achieve in natural ways because you're bombarded with information all the time. And not just from the outside, but also the inside. So even procedures such as sensory deprivation in tanks or all of that would be quite effective at removing the external information, but it's still quite ineffective at removing the internal imagery, while Bufalvaris goes past that and basically empties the external and the internal world, so that then you're only left with the sheer architecture of your mind.
Now, a lot of people say that the 5-MeO, the toad experience, is the most powerful entheogenic experience. You claim that the dream state is the most powerful psychedelic experience.
Well, it's the most powerful endogenous natural psychedelic state. In fact, I think that a lot of the machinery that we are equipped with in our day-to-day life is designed, for lack of a better word, to be manipulated in the sleep state. And the drugs can tap into this system and can alter some of the mechanics within it. But during the dream state, this is something that is sustainable, is healthy, and fully integrated in mechanics of maintenance and self-restructuring and repair. So yes, the dream state is very important, and this is why psychedelics are very important, because they're very quick and they're very precise in what they do. Although they are not particularly organic, they're not necessarily natural. You know, and then we would have to discuss on the actual nature of natural. But if one is to really master a very sustainable and integrative way to work on his own neuronal, mental and psychological substrate, the dream state is one that is very powerful and very useful, and one that actually runs in the background without us even knowing every night.
Now, after the publication of Rick Strassman's book, the DMT, the spirit molecule, a lot of people jumped onto the bandwagon saying this is it, the pineal gland is the seat of consciousness and DMT is the spirit molecule, the interface that opens up the interface between the physical and the transcendental or spirit world, whatever you want to call it. Now, there was a debate at Breaking Convention recently with Dennis McKenna and David Nichols and Gmo and another guy, an anthropologist who wrote several books on DMT. And basically it was David Nichols saying that DMT is released in far too low concentrations in the plasma that it could never possibly have a psychoactive effect. So therefore the theory that Rick Strassman proposed of it being responsible for all these mystical experiences in countless holy scriptures is null and void. Can you provide a comment on that?
So DMT is produced in the brain. It's been detected in several species and in indirect ways in humans as well. But then the validity of these secretions, it's what is very much debatable. So DMT follows specific metabolic pathways in the brain, and it can be synthesized from specific cascades which revolve around melatonin metabolism. And melatonin is widely known and recognized to be produced in the pineal gland. So of course it's very tempting, it's very seductive to think that all this machinery would be there also to lead the synthesis to DMT. Unfortunately, while this in theory is possible, experimentally it's never been fully validated. The amount of DMT that is produced is likely to be extremely small. And specific experiments have been carried out in mice mostly, where they blocked, for instance, the degradation and ultimately the metabolism of DMT through a blockade at monoamine oxidase, which is the chief enzyme that breaks down DMT and other catecholamines such as dopamine and serotonin, noradrenaline. And the outcome in terms of the experimental setup is to lead towards an accumulation of DMT in the brain, since it cannot be destroyed anymore. And after extended time frames of blocking the degradation of DMT, the amounts that have then been found in the brain of mice was in the levels of picograms, which is a step below micrograms. It's very, very little. And in terms of receptor activation, especially at 5-HT2 receptors, this is not enough to elicit the kind of meaningful psychedelic experiences that we associate with DMT, which is usually in the scale of micrograms, which are almost impossible to attain in a natural way. So DMT is there, or likely it's there, but there's just not enough of it to really drive a psychedelic experience. And in fact, even in the brain of humans, harvested post-mortem, DMT has not even been found at all. Then there's different theories. DMT may actually be broken down quite quickly after death. So after these brains are harnessed, there may not be any more up to that point, at that point, even though there could have been some before. But nonetheless, many other neurotransmitters follow the same fate, and we can still detect them. So yes, DMT is very powerful, DMT is very meaningful, it's one of the most incredible psychedelics. But for the data that we have available today, this is how we ought to treat it, as a psychedelic, as an exogenous psychedelic that you have to provide in flat doses to really drive a real psychedelic experience. At the level of the endogenous production, we have no evidence that this actually occurs. And the romanticization of DMT, the endogenous DMT in the brain, and especially at the level of the pineal gland, it's still very much a fairy tale. It's beautiful, it makes sense, the iconography throughout history corroborates this, but scientifically we have no evidence whatsoever that this actually is the case.
Now, a friend of mine, John Dean, he works in the research team of GMO at Michigan State University, and they conducted experiments on rodents where they injected potassium chloride into the heart to cause instant death, and at the same time they measured via a probe inserted into the pineal gland the spike of DMT, and it increases by at least 3 times the threshold baseline level. But you're still saying that it will be far too low to elicit a psychedelic experience.
For anything to be really psychedelic, for DMT, considering we are working with picograms, you would have to augment the concentration of it, not by 300% or even 1,000%. This would actually have to spike 100 times, 1,000 times, and still we would struggle, especially considering that would really have to be the case within seconds. Not even saliva gets produced at that kind of rate. So we're really struggling with the numbers here. And in terms of that, other experiments have been carried out, and it is true. At the moment of death, there is a spike in the production of a number of neurotransmitters, and DMT can definitely be one of them. But this can be explained in different ways as well. When a subject is to die, there's a number of mechanisms within the brain that prepare the brain for potential death. This usually extends at the level of augmented cortical activity, meaning that the last layer of the brain, the cortex, the one that usually provides us with consciousness, fires up much more than normal. There's many explanations for this. The most intuitive is that the brain at that stage knows that the situation is critical, and so it creates the basis for lack of a better word, endogenous doping of performance, so that this is the last resort to make critical, salient and effective decisions through in electronic systems. It could be termed an overclocking of the cortical activity to have more information, to make better decisions. This increased cortical activity very often translates into secretion and production of all neurotransmitters: glutamate, serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and of course DMT would just jump on this bandwagon itself. But this doesn't necessarily make it about DMT, and nonetheless, this kind of phenomena that people that are about to die or they've been brought back from death and all of this describe are actually far more likely to be driven by just higher cortical activity and all these other neurotransmitters being secreted in higher amounts.
Now there's two very interesting psychedelics which are extremely low. Very little research has been done in science, and they're especially idiosyncratic and bizarre in their effects. One is Salvinorum A from the Salvia plant, and the other Datura. Now I believe you have some experience. Would you like to share your experience, perhaps starting with Salvia?
Well, Salvia is definitely a strange one. Strange one in many ways. The experience that is associated with it, it's definitely an unforgettable one. It's very strong, it's very weird, and it produces a very specific type of dissociation. It's described as a drug that basically affects feelings of body ownership. So body parts cease to feel like they are yours, and you observe them in the same way you would observe the arm of a chair or someone else's feet, none of your own. And this is still very poorly understood, and it's dependent upon one receptor only. This is ultimately, for what we know now, the most special thing about salvinorin A, the active component of Salvia divinorum. Salvinorin A is unique. Shulgin himself said that all psychedelics are unique in their own respect, and that's absolutely true. However, salvinorin A is truly unique at the pharmacological level. Every single other substance we know, either natural or synthetic, act at the variety of receptors in the brain, spanning serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, adrenaline, sigma, imidazoline, transporters, channels, you name it. Salvinorin A instead acts on one, and one only receptor, kappa opioid receptor. So many studies have been done, they all shown the same results. In the spectrum of binding and in the spectrum of affecting receptors, salvinorin A acts only at kappa opioid receptors. Not even pharmaceutical tools ever developed in laboratories ever managed to have that level of selectivity, with the exception of antibodies, which are not small molecules. They are very complex, and they are not really an option in terms of use because they're very big and you need to inject them in the brain. So salvinorin A is unique, and it's extremely potent. LSD, one of the most potent, if not arguably the most potent psychedelic we know at the level of the quantity required for the experience to be perceived, works at the level of micrograms. For salvinorin A to be fully effective in that kind of magnitude, you would need about 10 times what's required for LSD. The difference is that LSD is ingested, or it can also be absorbed through the skin. It can be injected, doesn't matter. But everything that you administer with LSD gets inside the body and eventually inside the brain, and it produces the actual effect. With salvinorin A, it's not that easy. It can be absorbed through the mucosa, although slowly, not very effectively. It's not particularly suitable for injection. It has to be smoked. So when 10 times the amount that are required for potency with LSD are administered with salvinorin A, you're not actually absorbing the whole thing. You need to burn it. So a lot of it goes back into the atmosphere, some just sticks to the pipe, then the rest is vaporized, it enters the lungs, then it needs to enter the actual mucosa of the lungs, get inside the bloodstream, and then it needs to get inside the brain through the blood-brain barrier. By the time it actually gets inside the brain, it's no longer that much. It's actually a fraction of the amount you put into the pipe in the first place, suggesting that at the level of potency as well, we may have broadly the same potency as LSD, if not even slightly more. So yeah, Salvia is definitely one of a kind. Very interesting.
Now, Datura, it's only used by very experienced shamans in the Amazon who use it very, very sparingly. Other than that, it's used pretty widespread amongst sadhus and swamis in India. Indeed, we were talking to Rio earlier today, who said that he met a swami that was taken from his family. His family gave him over to a bunch of swamis because they saw promise in him from a very young age. And from the age of 6, he was chewing on Datura with betel nut. And they seem to have harnessed its properties to bolster their spiritual progression. You've had some experience. Can you share some of your insights?
Well, Datura, it's definitely a troubled child in the realm of psychoactive entheogens. It's highly toxic, it's highly psychoactive, and not just centrally inside the brain, but also peripherally. It acts on a very specific subclass of acetylcholine receptors, the muscarinic ones. And the muscarinic receptors are not just in the brain, they're also in the periphery, working alongside the ganglions to produce peripheral effects. These include secretions in the mouth, dilation of pupils, goosebumps, all these peripheral things. So when one is to consume Datura, which whose active constituents are scopolamine and atropine, the antimuscarinic compounds, there's a whole range of symptoms that one experiences during the progression into the altered state. And eventually also the heart gets affected, and blood vessels get affected. It's very dangerous. So there's a very thin veil between the shamanic use and the lethal concentration. So yes, Datura is not a plant to be taken irresponsibly. It's very hazardous. I have consumed it myself several times, and at least a couple of them I still feel I am lucky to be alive, because what happens is that you lose total control of who you are, where you are, what you're doing. Your moral compass becomes disintegrated. It's tricky, and you may lose awareness of where you are and then regain it several hours later, from 3, 2, 5, 10, 1, 2 days, a time frame in which you're fully capable of action, you're coordinated, you seem to know what you're doing, but you're stripped of your natural decision making. So you are basically propelled into a state of deep sleep dreaming, very similar to sleepwalking. And anything really goes during that time frame, where a subject can be extremely injurious to him or herself and those around them.
Okay, for the final question, I became quite fixated on the phenomenon of terminal lucidity, whereby people with neurological degenerative diseases such as CJD or Alzheimer's, they become like vegetables and they lose up to 50% or more of their neurons, and there's vacuoles in the brain, like holes form and the brain shrinks. And yet, just before they die, in between about 5 and 10% of these people, they regain their full cognitive faculties, and they call up their loved ones and relatives and friends and say, "I love you, goodbye," and then soon after they pass away. This is a huge anomaly in science. No one seems to be able to explain this phenomenon. When I posed this question to a panel which included some scientists, including Rudolf Tanzi and Deepak Chopra, obviously Deepak Chopra went into consciousness, is not doesn't come from the brain, it's non-local, etc., and this is proof for that. What possible explanation would you like to put forth?
Well, first and foremost, I personally don't believe that the person goes back to full faculty.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Would it be okay to take a photo of this? One of you?
We are doing an interview.
5 more minutes.
Oh my god, I'm so sorry.
They don't go fully back to full cognitive.
So I don't personally believe that these people go back to full faculty predating the neurodegeneration. They most likely return to a level of mental capacity that allows them to at least convey their last messages, which doesn't necessarily need.
But this could in itself prove that consciousness and memories are not stored locally in the brain or generated from the brain.
Oh, absolutely, but at the same time we have no scientific tool to fully elaborate on that. In terms of the ability for these individuals to carry out these last important undertakings before dying, can be described in the same way I tried to elucidate the spiking of DMT and neurotransmitters just before death. The brain is about to die, the body is signaling it, and therefore the brain knows that this is it. This usually leads to a surge of cortical activity.
And which neurotransmitters in particular? I discussed this with a Harvard neuroscientist, and she said that glutamate would be the main neurotransmitter involved, and your brain would just be flooded with it as you reach death, and your brain tries a last-ditch resort to survive. And her money was a glutamate being responsible.
I would concur. I would agree glutamate may be the most powerful drive. Then we also need to consider the other neurotransmitters to provide richness for the messages that are to be conveyed. And these would include, of course, dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, oxytocin even. But yes, glutamate is by far the major transmitter to get shit done. And when the situation becomes that critical, you need to do it. And you need to do it fast, and you need to do it as well as you can. I think glutamate is definitely at the top of the pyramid, and then there's all the others under.
Okay. You plan to film some documentaries exploring indigenous cultures in remote parts of the world, like rainforests and deserts, etc. What is your purpose and reasoning behind it? Do you think they have some ancient entheogenic usage that we could bring back and help Western society?
Oh, absolutely. Like we, in the last few hundred years, gave full agency to our decision making in terms of society to a very specific model, which is that of the scientific method. And that has served us very well. I'm a scientist myself, and of course abide by the general guidelines of the procedure. But of course, the scientific method is bound to be constrained by the technology available at any given time. This usually makes things faster and makes them very precise and very reproducible. Alternative methods have been deployed throughout history by other cultures that instead were given much more extended time frames, generations over generations, hundreds of years, thousands of years, where they could carry out a similar procedure, but not through technological methodology, but mostly through trial and error, constant improvement in their tribes, in their practice, and they would eventually work out what works best, what kills more, what kills less, within the tribe through constant feedback. So I personally believe that they have a lot to teach, and not necessarily in a magical way or an esoteric way. There's also that aspect of things which I don't personally discuss much because I try to be as evidence-based as possible, but trial and error is very much what science is based upon as well. And these cultures have definitely done that plenty. So
it seems like some of their practice might harness the phenomenon of the placebo effect, which is a scientific fact and cannot be
100%. The placebo effect is very powerful. It's very important. We use it every day, even in domains that we're not aware of. So these cultures have a lot to teach. We have a lot to learn. And with the scientific method, we have a very powerful substrate that still needs a lot of inspiration and a lot of teachings. Then we can try to integrate one way or another. And for us to do that, we could carry out, our normal advancement in the ways we've always done it, but we risk reinventing the wheel in our own way, which could be a little bit more low resolution, a little bit more approximate, or we could try to go there, trying to take systems that have already been tried and tested a lot, and then try to integrate them in our understanding of the world. And this is why I long to be in close contact with these cultures, try to go there with as little bias as possible, and see how they've approached problems that we're still working on now and we've not found solutions for, and try to bring back some of the wisdom in their own way and eventually in our own.
Thank you very much. Nice.
Cheers.